Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the Magical Podcast. Today we have with us Dan Fuse. He's our product manager, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with him about the role of product managers at startups and how to make that decision. When should you hire one? How do you work with one? And many other interesting ideas and topics. So, welcome, Dan. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this is an interesting and debatable topic, and so yeah, it'll be fun to chat about. We haven't really chatted about it that much. It'll be yeah, good to talk about it and also maybe create some conversation online.
Yeah, absolutely. Because even now, from my YC batchmates, or like when people ask us like what our team is like, and I say it's five full time people, and then we have a product manager, and we have and people always ask me like, why do you have a product manager at such a young startup? So it's definitely something that keeps coming up, and so this is a good way to. I hope I can just send this over to people and say, here are all the reasons why we have it, and why maybe you should consider one. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Why do you think it's a debate? Why do you think it's like not an obvious hire like a designer or engineers? Because product managers help build the product, so they're certainly adding to the process. So why is it still a debate?
Yeah, I think there's at least two reasons. I'm sure there are more. I think one is there's a lot of contrasting information online. I think one common stance is hire a product manager when you're raising a Series A. I think one stance is some, especially technical startups, said maybe wait a bit later. And then even someone like Bill Campbell, who I really respect, and I think Eric Schmidt wrote a great book about. And if Eric Schmidt writes a book about you, you've done something well. He has a quote saying like your first hire should be a product manager, which is interesting. And so I think really smart people say different things. So I think that makes it a bit debatable. And then I think PMs ultimately aren't coding, and so I'm sure one stance is early days, like
Yeah,
just hire devs because they're
yeah, just hire
contribute.
people who
They're
can write code.
yeah. So and that's valid, or it's a valid perspective. So I think
Yeah.
those are probably two.
However,
Yeah.
I think devs need help, right? I think when you are in the weeds writing code all day, I don't think you really have the time or the entire context at times to sort of question the decisions a lot, or to say is this really the thing that should be built, and especially as you add more team members to the team. But before we get into that, I'm really curious, like, which book is that by Eric Schmidt? Do you remember the title?
Yeah, it's called Trillion Dollar Coach. It's a really good read, and it's
Okay,
about
got it. Awesome.
yeah. I think it's
We're going to
Bill
link to
Campbell
that in the
mentors.
show notes.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So, like, I can talk a little bit about why we hired you, right? And why you were actually the first hire we made. So both my co-founder and I, we are programmers, and then you were actually the very first hire we made. And it pretty much comes from my past of working at Support B, where we didn't have a product manager, and we did hire programmers, and then we did hire a designer, and we built pretty high quality features. But sometimes it has felt as if there was this kind of big picture missing of like how all of these things are adding up. Like, where is this taking the product? Are these the customers who are the most important ones to focus on? So while we were adding and improving the product a lot, it just felt as if we were not talking enough about the goals and the strategy. And as a CEO, I think you just have so many jobs that it's very hard to keep track of that process, like feedback or prioritization. And so for me, that was like a pretty big reason. What do you think are some of the pros of having a product manager early on at a startup?
Yeah, definitely. So I think our case was especially a little unique in that you could code. And so that, especially with technical co-founders, um, that's, a pro bringing in a PM and then kind of opening up coding time. But I think in general, I think there's a few. I think that a CEO probably has some tasks they're gonna or work they're gonna do in the future, such as creating a culture, hiring, fundraising, etc. And the earlier you bring on a PM, I think a CEO can kind of focus and build their skill set in those topics instead of kind of not maturing those skills and focusing on things that they probably don't really need to get good at, like writing tickets or kind of some of the, in the weeds project management type or kind of, yeah, managing engineers kind of in those weeds, or even kind of, yeah, medium level kind of product strategy and so forth. And so I think bringing a PM, that's one pro and can kind of help take a lot off a plate of a CEO for kind of work and skills they don't really need to spend time doing and won't in the future.
For example, I had been building products for a long time, but I had never used a sophisticated ticketing system. We use Shortcut now, which used to be Clubhouse. And I didn't really know that you could express these relationships like this ticket depends on this other one. So now you must finish this one before you actually can do this one. And you're able to visualize, and then you are able to get a sense of what are you taking on this iteration or in this epic. We were actually using Notion before that, and it was very lightweight. It felt like it worked, but a lot of times actually it was very hard to get any visibility into what was going on, where were things. Sometimes we had like three different things that were in beta, like released to some customers, but never shipped to everybody else. So there was a lot of that sort of chaos, I would say, that you helped and you came in and you helped it get better. I also want to touch a little bit that I agree that if you don't hire somebody early on, then you have to kind of do that work of handing off that knowledge to them later. Unless you, of course, maybe one of your engineers steps up to be a PM. Uh, it's a lot of like, it definitely, and I think probably that's one of the cons is it does take some time. Nobody can immediately come in and be effective. Maybe programmers can be in a small code base, but as a PM, there is probably a lot of knowledge. I'm curious to hear what was your experience. Here's your time to do a review of your onboarding.
Yeah, no, I think that segues into the second big pro and exactly what you're saying in that I think bringing on a PM before you have a huge kind of team of developers already in some sort of process and so forth really helps because it kind of gives you time to create those processes, to learn a bit more, to onboard, to learn about the product, to in your head have a prioritization of what kind of should be built. And then when more developers are brought on, I think that like really helps because then you have kind of everything in place and the developers come in, see that you've done the work, trust you, and can hit the ground running. And yeah, it kind of gives you that padding. And like I saw that in my previous job actually, which was at a boutique consulting firm, and we mostly did work for Apple. And for Apple projects, like we wouldn't start coding on day one. Like we'd start product managers and designers would start the project first, and we do a lot of discovery, a lot of user research, kind of build a backlog, do a lot of learning, put processes in place, and then developers would come in 2 to 4 weeks later, and everything would kind of, the table would be set for them. Everything would be perfect. Like the car would be gassed up, it'd be ready to go, and they could just hit the ground running. And that kind of felt like what's happened here, which was, I think, a really big pro and really big strength.
Yeah, there are two things I actually want to kind of talk about based on what you just said. One is I've actually been kind of surprised by how many good candidates in interviews when we try to hire them ask us about our roadmap. And now, because you maintain this public roadmap for us, it's very easy for us to send it to them and say, "Here is our roadmap," so they know this is actually something that we've committed to our customers, and it's a big trust builder. They know that the company is pretty serious about building a high quality product. And I think there was a second one that I just kind of lost track of it. It'll probably come back to me. I apologize. And what do you think are like some of the cons? I think what is a pro is also a con that it just takes time, right, for people to kind of ramp up to that role as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest con, like the biggest negative, is basically money or that trade-off where you either pay
Sure,
additional money for one salary or the trade-off of not having a developer. Like I think that's probably the most obvious
I think so.
negative
Yeah,
aspect. And the other one that I read about, I was kind of thinking about, but I think it's an interesting one to mention, and I think we should, yeah, even chat about it later, is Patrick Collison had a really interesting quote where he said, it's easy for product managers and product management structures to make programming less fun. And I think
that was
that's
actually my second point. Yeah, that's some of the
a,
fear sometimes people express, right?
Yeah, so that
And I think,
yeah,
in my experience at least, like there is a difference between sort of thinking about like the larger user problem and what should get, like what's the problem we are solving. I think like a role of a good project manager is to clarify the sort of like the why, not so much like the how, or it's more the why and the what. But I think in some companies, unfortunately, developers get handed these kind of like flow charts with if this then that and yes, and then they have unfortunately like no choice. Or I've heard horror stories of project managers deciding the tech stack sometimes, saying, "Hey, let's go use Elasticsearch," or whatever they have heard from their friends. And I think like we should clarify that at least we don't do it, and we don't think that's the reason to get a PM, right? Like in our company, at least we do
yep,
it more for the why. Is this a good problem, and how do we minimize the risk of building this?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, even I was talking to a friend, a software developer last night, and he was mentioning how it's just not fun to have story points. So I've never thought about that, but like, I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing to think about on how to make programming more fun and not a bit more mundane with tickets and so forth, where you have to have tickets, but yeah, it's something I'm going to think about, especially going forward, for sure. And
Maybe we'll do another one in a few months and talk about how our tickets have changed.
yeah, yeah, be a good podcast or blog post for sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about our process. Like we already talked a bit about like how we try to dig into the why or manage the feedback from customers and how it relates to the roadmap. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what are your responsibilities at MagicBell and how I think what you're doing is probably very typical of early stage startup hires, but maybe in your words you can describe that.
Yeah, so I'd say there are three, maybe like three buckets loosely I've been tackling, but one interesting part too is I think you just have to be kind of a jack of all trades and just hop on whatever needs done, which is an obvious statement, but and one thing I've really enjoyed, but something a PM would obviously have to expect. But I'd say yeah, maybe four kind of silos or buckets, and one's been user research, so really trying to formalize and track kind of that discovery and user research process. So we wrote a blog post about that listeners you can access, but it's really about how to kind of have user research, record user research, and then visualize it in an efficient and comprehensive way. So we've really been focusing on that. You've already mentioned shortcuts, so really focusing on kind of the more almost like the project management or delivery, more the delivery process and how to make that efficient and just um, more kind of communicate kind of the prioritization and work to everyone. So we've created public roadmaps, sprints, etc. So that having ceremonies and so forth. So yeah, those were two big focuses, and then we've focused a lot on or somewhat on analytics. Still, probably we can build that out a bit more, but trying to build out our analytics offerings and then our documentation and just writing as well. So trying to get what we do about it for our product and then also processes out into the world. So I think those are some of the larger chunks of work I've been focusing on the last couple of months.
Yeah, and I would say like I don't know if that's a traditional sort of or typical PM responsibility, but that's sort of that sushi chef or like that analogy we were talking about yesterday is like you've helped us a lot by writing documentation, release notes, keeping our customers updated, and over time I think probably somebody else would be doing it, but right now that help has been actually great, and it's really good to not decouple that from the rest of the product management process. I think the quote actually I was referring to, which you just kind of talked about as well, was this one. It says, early stage employees are chefs at a small restaurant. They're always changing the menu and trying new things. Working at a big company is like being a sushi chef. You cut the same fish every single day. And so this was from Finn Barnes, the board partner at First Round. And I think like that's what we were talking about. So you come for these like things, but then you might actually find yourself doing something that you didn't think would be part of the PM job. And I think you have to be open to helping the company wherever it needs help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so now let's move on to What is our recommendation for other startups? How should they think about this decision? You've obviously laid out, but is there like a checklist or a pros and cons list they can go through? How would you encourage them to think about this decision?
Yeah, well, so I think I'm a bit biased, but I would say it's worked out well. And my recommendation, so I think we talked about it a bit briefly before, but Marty Kagan is I think, a kind of known leader in the tech space. And he really advocates kind of agile. And I think one of the main points of agile is having kind of a technical leader or your tech lead, a product person or someone thinking about kind of the overall vision and strategy and so forth, and a designer about how your product's going to be used. Kind of having those three roles, or kind of people thinking about those different three directions, kind of working together very closely every day and kind of guiding the discovery and delivery of the product is like really valuable, and not missing one of those three pieces and not keeping them in silos so they kind of happen sequentially. And so my personal opinion is I've kind of what I've seen the best software being delivered. It's been a cross-functional team having all three of those components and not working in silos, but working throughout the product development process. But as I said, kind of discovery and delivery. So I think from that perspective, I think having all three pieces as early as possible while building a product is really beneficial. So that's, I guess, how I would think about it at a very high level. But yeah, as we talked
I
about, I
also
think
think
there's
that
I was just gonna say, yeah, there's pros and risks as well. So
it also depends on like where you want to spend your time, probably as one of the co-founders of the business, or especially most of the time CEOs are the one kind of running the product function. But like, how long do you want to run it? Do you need to spend your time on sales or marketing or kind of finding the product market fit, or maybe even fundraising? Like, fundraising is a really long process. And in fact, every time you go out to fundraise, which you have to kind of do more often now in this environment where everything is more expensive, if you are the product person, you can pretty much be sure that for a few months, your product is going to like suffer. And so I would say, even if you're running that function well today, like you said, like maybe you are a good product manager and you're actually running it really well. When you do depart or do fundraising, you are going to not be able to spend time on your product. Paul Graham, Y Combinator, they've all written about it that when you're fundraising, you shouldn't actually work on the product. You shouldn't do anything else. You should just be fundraising for a few months and then closing the round and then getting back to it. And at that point, I think it'd be very hard for someone else to step into that, or for you to be able to hire someone to like come in and immediately help you. So I think having people early on, especially if you're a funded startup, I think definitely makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Great. I feel like we've covered everything else. Is there anything you want to cover before we sort of sign off?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot, and I think this would be a good blog post as well. So I think listeners can anticipate an upcoming blog post too.
Yeah, or any questions on Twitter, we'd be happy to answer them. You don't have a Twitter, but I can relay the questions to you.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much for listening in, and see you in the next episode. Bye.
Yeah, have a good day, everyone.